Kaplan from the University of Hong Kong, speaking about land use and climate change modeling. Go ahead, Jed.
Thank you, Ruben. Hello, everyone. Good evening from Hong Kong. So yes, thanks again to Ruben and to the other organizers of this very interesting workshop for the invitation to come and chat with you today and tell you a little bit about some of the research I've been involved in the Mediterranean, understanding human environment interactions. So before I launch into it, I want to really acknowledge that what I'm going to show today is mostly results that emerged out of a Swedish project called Domesticated Landscapes of the Peloponnese, which was led by Erika Weiberg from Uppsala University. And I'm very grateful to her for her leadership on this project and to her colleagues at Uppsala, Anton Bonnier and Martin Finet, and my postdoc Ryan Hughes for all of the work that they put into the DOPE project over many years, and also to collaborators around the world who participate in the project by especially by contributing data and helping us to interpret the results that we are getting. So this was very much a team effort, and actually it's continued on in various forms since the actual project ended. Okay, so how did this start? Well, I think one of the things that's been really nice hearing from David's presentation just a moment ago was it was a great introduction to the climate variability of the Eastern Mediterranean during antiquity. And so you actually saved me a lot of time, thank you, and having to explain important background. But a lot of what we did in the Domesticated Landscapes project was sort of stimulated by an earlier paper by colleagues who really wanted to try to understand some of the questions related to the role of climate variability and climate change in influencing ancient societies in Greece and in the Peloponnese in particular. And some of that was outlined in this 2016 paper, and that was sort of the launching point for our project, where we had the fortune, I would say, of being able to work in a location where there's a lot of archaeology, obviously, and I think many of you here are archaeologists, so I don't need to belabor the point that the Peloponnese is a region that has been very intensively studied for more than a century from an archaeological perspective, and so we know a lot about the archaeology of the Peloponnese, and that is very fortunate. And at the same time, we have paleo-environmental archives that are, in situ or local to a lot of the archaeology, in particular these three very important cave sites where we have speleothems, so we have stalactites and stalagmites, effectively, that can be analyzed for their geochemistry, which gives us an idea of what past climate was like. And this feeds very nicely into what David already talked about in his presentation. And indeed there, one of the things that stimulated a lot of our research was exactly, as David said, the 3.2K event or late Bronze Age collapse, this period when there was societal change all around the Eastern Mediterranean, and that included, of course, as well, the Peloponnese. And so the paleo-environmental archives for this period, which are outlined in the red bar there, do give you a little bit of an idea. Unfortunately, two of the most important stalagmites do not really cover the 3.2 K period, but the other one, the Aleppo Trippa cave, actually ends sort of at the during the 3.2 event, but nevertheless, there are some indications that it was drier in the Peloponnese at that time. But this is not the only period in antiquity when there were sort of important climate shifts. And in fact, there was also a period in the early Roman, or in the Roman period in the Peloponnese, when there is also this area outlined in gray here, where there's suggestion that there were also drier conditions throughout the Peloponnese. So these are two periods when we were very interested in trying to understand what role this kind of climate variability could have played in influencing society. And there are all kinds of hypotheses or theories, if you want, out there about how important climate change could have been. And I think, again, David gave a very nice introduction to those during his presentation. But in my view, environmental variability by itself is rarely the proximate cause or the only driver of social change, because humans are highly adaptable. We can adapt to different kinds of environments. Okay, but climate change may have stimulated changes in land use and economic systems that ultimately to long-term societal change. And really, how can we explore that? Well, one of the ways that we can do that is by using numerical models, and that's what I'm going to concentrate on for the rest of my presentation. This was one of the things that we attempted to do during the DOLT project. We wanted to model the human environment system, and in doing that, we acknowledge that there are certain characteristics of the physical environment that constrain people's interaction with it. Okay, if it's simply too cold, there are certain crops that you cannot grow. If it's too hot, there are other crops you cannot grow. Likewise, if it's too wet or too dry. Okay, but humans in general do not always behave in a perfectly rational way. All right, actual land use is a function not only the properties of the physical environment, but also the sociocultural attributes of that population. And so we set out, actually now many years ago, I set out to develop a process model that recognizes this interplay, between sociocultural characteristics and the properties of the physical environment, and combines them in a human environment interactions model that would allow us to estimate things like actual land use at a given time and in a particular space, the land cover in a particular place, and even the potential population, so demographic change over time. Now, this is a simplified way of looking at this model, and it's actually a bit more complex than that, but I'm going to take you through it in a moment. But suffice to say, you've got these sociocultural characteristics and you have properties of the physical environment, and those come together. So just to tell you a little bit more about what I mean, let's first start with the properties of the physical environment. So when I talk about the properties of the physical environment, I mean the climate, the soils, topography, and these are things that we can typically collect in sort of gridded maps. And so here's a few examples. There's a topographic map of the Peloponnese. On the right is a map of slope. The green areas are areas that can be cultivated without terracing, all right, without any kind of extra efforts done to mitigate things like soil erosion. And the wider areas are areas that are that basically require engineering in order to grow crops on them. And one of the things, of course, you can notice right away is that the Peloponnese is quite mountainous, and large parts of the landscape are not really very suitable for agriculture, at least not with a lot of labor and effort in it. The Peloponnese also has interesting climate, which is in part driven by the mountain ranges, of course, but then also there's a general trend from wetter climate in the west to drier climate in the east, and that in particular, when we think about the societies that develop here in the eastern Peloponnese, we can think about how they might be sensitive to short-term environmental variability, because we're looking at rainfall, annual rainfall, sort of under 500 or 550 millimeters on the long-term average, which is getting close to the sort of absolute environmental limits for getting a good cereal harvest. And likewise, you can see that the minimum temperatures are very much influenced by proximity to the sea and mountains. We can also look at things like the physical properties of the soil. I won't belabor those, but just to suffice to say that those are the kind of information that goes into a model like this. So what can we predict on the basis of the environment? We can predict water resources, soil fertility. We can understand how climate influences where you can grow certain things, or how much pasture grass will grow. And ultimately, we can predict something like crop yield, and we can think about how that yields will be variable over time and how it could be vulnerable to climate shifts or climate variability. So here's just some very, very coarse resolution maps showing crop yield, but these are the kind of information that we can extract from the physical environment by itself. Now, that by itself is not really enough, as I explained already. We need to know something about how people lived in the past. And in that, we need to know things that we cannot predict on, I would argue anyway, that we cannot predict on the basis of the environment. Things like subsistence, livelihood, and diet, technology, social organization. There's a certain amount of path dependency in the choices that people make about what they eat and what kind of technologies they adopt. There are various other social constraints that control what people use and when they use it and so on. And so some social scientists have attempted to model these kind of sociocultural evolution and diffusion, but I would argue that particularly in a place like the Peloponnese, we don't need to do that because we have this really good archaeological data. And so if we can use that archaeological data to identify and categorize and quantify different livelihood systems, then we may map those distributions in space and time, and we can use that as an input to our human environment models. And so how do we do that? Well, we first of all have to recognize that this is sort of too much work for one person, because nobody can really be an expert in all of these different systems and over time. And so we did that in the adult project in a very collaborative way, really trying to assemble a group of experts, particularly archaeologists, archaeobotanists, and paleoecologists, to get together and review published data and literature review from different sites and context, from historical accounts, so we worked with historians as well, and create through a kind of conservative extrapolation, if you want, a picture. And this is very interesting. You see the photo of the people in the below, and if some of you know Paul Halstead, who's standing sort of right behind me, is looking very unhappy in this picture. And part of the reason why is because we kept pushing him out of his comfort zone, asking him to make the kind of generalizations that many archaeologists are and historians are uncomfortable about doing. But we said, if we cannot assemble these kind of data and generalize them in some way, then we cannot use them in our model. So we had archaeological data sites. As I mentioned, the Peloponnese is very rich in archaeology from all different periods, from the Neolithic right through till classical antiquity, a Roman period. And these, just to give you an idea of, our sites are distributed throughout the region. Okay, and we taking that data, the very first thing that we sat down to do as a group was to develop a kind of timeline. And we realized, sort of, when we think about the Peloponnese from a land use perspective, the classical archaeological divisions of time did not really work for us. And so we came up with something, this is now published last year in the Journal of Land Use Science, where we divided up time in the Peloponnese, and we also tried to assign a kind of very simple relative social complexity to the different societies that lived throughout this period. And they go from sort of low to medium to high. It's a very, very basic scale, starting in the Neolithic with low complexity societies and going through to, say, the Roman period with more complex ones, but with some variation over time, as you can see. So we have these sociocultural characteristics, and by collecting these data, the first thing that we did is to create categories, as you can see here in the middle, and those categories involved sort of a hierarchy of different types of land use. So this technique has now been adopted by other groups of archaeologists worldwide. Understanding or recognizing that there are agricultural types of land use and non-agricultural types of land use, and that all of these different types of land use can allow a society to subsist. All right, and I won't go into the details of this, but if you have questions about it, I'm happy to talk about it afterwards. We also recognize that animal production was very important, not so much pastoralism as you might think of it in, say, the African sense or something, but certainly many of the different domesticated animals that existed in antiquity were present in the present Peloponnese, particularly, of course, cattle, donkeys, sheep, goats, and fowl and pigs. So we took that, in a paper we did a few years ago, we tried to explain how animal production is also has a variety of intensities and mobilities associated with it. We incorporate that into our model, which again is not really worth belaboring at this point, except to say that what we have here at the top are our estimated lifestyles. Okay, so we have a kind of lifestyles that we assume or reconstructed people to have at a particular time, and that includes information about their diet. It includes information about the kind of utensils and natural resources that those people use, including ceramics and metals and things like that. And putting that all together, we actually calculate land use areas required to subsist for a society with that lifestyle to subsist. And I'm just going to give you a few examples of the results of those calculations. Okay, so here we have low, medium intensity, and we plot the medium and high intensity. We plot those on what we call a circle diagram, and they look like this. And for the sake of time, I won't really describe these in detail, but you can have a look at them afterwards. Suffice to say that they change over time, and they also change in the number of people who can subsist on a certain type of landscape. So there is intensification of land use over time, and there's also a variety of land uses related to people's actual lifestyle. So someone who is a slave or poor might have a much smaller ecological footprint than an elite person in the ancient Peloponnese. Likewise, climate variability can lead to changes in the land required to feed a certain number of people. So here a town of 3,800 people under standard yield conditions, under half yield conditions, and under double yield conditions, and the sort of change in their ecological footprint. So moving back to the timeline of Peloponnesian land use, what we see then in our results is a gradual intensification of land use over time. But at the same time, because there is a diversification of land use, people actually use more land per capita closer to the present. So time goes from left to right in this plot than they did in the distant past. So we see a decline through the Neolithic, basically related to intensification, but that's followed by an increase in per capita land use on the y-axis related to this diversification of land uses. And this is all detailed in the Journal of Land Use Science paper, but just to give you a little bit more of an idea of to what level of detail we bring this, we actually assign areas to settlements, to field crops, to tree crops, and to pasture and rangeland, and those all sort of fall under this calculation. There is archaeological evidence, of course, for this diversification of land use, which is driving this increase in per capita land use. And this is, of course, through archaeobotanical and zooarchaeological, attested through archaeobotanical and zooarchaeological evidence. So finally, now we have this sort of timeline of land use, and we can see how it changes over time. It's quite interesting to investigate how that changes in space, and I want to show you sort of the latest outcome of this kind of results, which comes from a paper that's just published at the end of last year, led by Ingmar Unkel and Erika Weiberg and Daniel Knitter, of course, who show now now this is for the very northeastern part of the Peloponnese, with the Isthmus of Corinth here in the upper right, what the spatial pattern or what the suitability for land use could have been in different places. Okay, so here it comes back to what I described earlier in my presentation. Not all of the lands, the properties of the physical landscape constrain what kind of activities can take place in certain places and certain times. And under a normal scenario, which is in these top two plots here, we see land suitable for agriculture, which is generally flatter areas. Okay, there's not much of a climatic gradient over this landscape. So we're effectively looking at flatter areas, and arboriculture has a larger area of suitable land because the idea is that arboriculture can take place on steeper slopes, but still not on the highest mountains, of course. And then under a dry scenario, what happens to that landscape? Well, a lot less of the land becomes suitable for cultivation. Okay. Now, the other thing we can do is we can see precisely what this implies for the distribution of land use around settlements. And here we have the larger settlements in the northeast and some smaller ones in the northeastern Peloponnese, and sort of spatially explicit, if you want, land use footprint could look like under different conditions of climate, a normal and a dry scenario. And the conclusion from this paper is effectively that the larger settlements like Mycenae and Argos and Tiryns would not have been able to feed themselves anyway with the area immediately surrounding the settlements, that they must have, settlements of that size must have relied on trade and so the supply of food from the hinterlands. All right, and this would have, of course, under normal conditions, the establishment of a highly networked society where trade, even if it's relatively short distance trade, was important. But under dry conditions, as David explained in his presentation, think about 3.2 events as a period of cold and dry climate. Under dry conditions, it could have led to a strain on that highly networked system. So just to summarize and finish up here, it has been hypothesized, as I mentioned, that environmental variability and change may have led to societal change, and we've heard that now. You've heard that now twice just today, and we can test some of those hypotheses with models. All right, and those models, the quantitative models that we've developed in my lab in the last few years, really allow us to calculate things like land use requirements. In the Peloponnese during the Bronze Age, the large settlements must have relied on external trade for resource, and it could be short distance trade. We're not talking about long distance trade, but that highly networked economic system may have preconditioned society to be vulnerable to climate variability. So when we think back 1,000 years earlier to another abrupt climate change event, the 4,200 BP event, we don't see the same although there might have been a climatic event which was just as intense or just as strong, and in some cases it's probably even more widespread than whatever happened 3,200 years ago. It was probably the socioeconomic system which made the society vulnerable. Okay, I'll leave it with that, and we'll happily take questions during our discussion. And thank you very much again for the invitation and your attention.